you. Okay, thank you. If anyone can't hear me, I'll take this out and walk with it, but I'm pretty loud most of the time because I talk to people on boats a lot. So I'm going to talk about seabirds by season on the Stormy Petrel II. So I'm from Hatteras, North Carolina. I'm not from there, but I have been there for a long time. I work for a company that takes people offshore to look at seabirds. And the vessel that our company owns to do that is the Stormy Petrel II. So tonight we're going to go through kind of seabirds by season, and I'll introduce you to some of the species that we encounter there from Hatteras. Yesterday when I was putting this together, I was double checking it all, and I was like, oh, seabirds by season on the Stormy Petrel II, but I don't have any pictures of the Stormy Petrel II. So I like went through really quickly, and this is a picture looking towards the stern of our boat on the way out one morning. I usually try to take a sunrise picture every morning and post that, and that's from the bow. We have a nice bow pulpit. The boat's about 56 feet long. It's pretty comfortable for what we do with the walk around deck. And this was a pretty calm day. Not every day is super calm, but I'll tell you, that's what it's always like out there. It's beautiful. So we're going to start with a really general overview, just so we can kind of orient ourselves. This Hatteras is where this arrow is pointing. And that's not why I wanted to show you this. I wanted to show you this because I want you to look at the continental shelf. So when you're looking at the way that moves on the East Coast, the way that's situated on the East Coast, we are the closest point to the deep water on the East Coast of the US. That means we have a lot of really great things going on there. This is a zoomed in picture so you can see the coast down here, and this is Hatteras Island, so that's where we're based. Hatteras Inlet down here at the southern end of that island is our primary port. That's where our boat is mostly docked. That's also the closest point to the deep water on the East Coast. So that's why we make people drive all the way down there to go offshore, because it's only about 25 miles to get to the shelf break, which is 600 feet deep, and a lot of trips we go out to over 6,000 feet deep. So you can imagine, you know, how much longer that takes from South Carolina or even Virginia, or even Oregon Inlet, which is the other port to the north that we sometimes use for our trips. We'll talk about why we might want to have a secondary port as we go through this. So this is a really dynamic place. We have a cold water current coming down from the north, the Labrador current, and that coincides with the Gulf Stream current, which we all should be familiar with living on the southeastern coast of the US. It's an incredibly fast-moving warm water current that's not super full of life. It's actually void of a lot of life, which is why it has that deep blue color, because there's not a lot to interrupt the light as it's moving down into the ocean. But when you put that together with that cold water current coming from the north, the Labrador current, you get what's called a deposition zone. So you have a fallout of a lot of nutrients. It makes this area east of Hatteras, oh, sorry about that. This area east of Hatteras Island incredibly rich. So it's a good place for fishing. It's also a good place for seabirds. And every day is different, because you all might know how dynamic the Gulf Stream is. It's never the same 2 days in a row. So all of these together with that deep water right off the coast makes it a really spectacular place to get out and see seabirds that spend their lives at sea. So we're going to go through this by season. Each season I'll have a temperature map, a sea surface temperature map, to just kind of indicate what's going on with the water temperatures offshore from us. Again, you can see Hatteras Island is right here, and we already have our 2025 schedule up. So each slide beginning a season will also have the dates that we're running our trips next year. In the wintertime, we run a primary departure date with a secondary weather date, because the weather's a little more volatile in the winter than it is in the spring and summer. But as you can see, that this blue color here, and here you have your key with the temperatures in Fahrenheit. That blue water is really cold. In the winter, we get north winds. It pushes that cold water right down around Cape Hatteras. So we're looking for cold water species in the winter. We're not going to the Gulf Stream. What we're looking for are species that would be more associated with that cold water and the winds and the currents bringing those birds down to our area. So this is a list of species we've recorded on winter trips. I'm just talking about pelagic species, or seabird species mostly, that we see on these trips. And in the background there is a northern fulmar. So that's a sort of would be a special bird to see on a winter trip. It's a pretty good list of birds. So the species that, we'll go through this kind of like with what we hope to see, what we usually see, and the things that can be kind of hit or miss. Like we see them every season, but maybe not on every trip. Great skua is the bird that people come from all over to look for because it's the one place in the US you have a chance to see this species in the ABA area. And we usually see them on about 50% of our winter trips. That being said, they were hit really hard by avian influenza. And so we'll see what plays out in the next few years. This past season, they didn't find any great skuas offshore on our winter trips. So we've had some really special visitors. Yellow-nosed albatross, the last time we had one of those was in 2014. That was from Hatteras. And black-browed albatross. So pretty spectacular. Most people don't even know that you could have an albatross in the Atlantic Ocean, much less from a place like Hatteras. But we've had both species periodically show up on our winter trips there from Hatteras. So the usual suspects, northern gannet. Is everyone familiar with northern gannet here? They do get down this far. This is an adult pictured here on the top right. We also see the young individuals. It's always really exciting when someone's never seen a young gannet before because they just start yelling, "What is that dark bird out there?" You know, but they take 4 years to reach that adult plumage. So sometimes you'll see some really odd-looking gannets in the wintertime, but we usually see those on all of our winter trips, and they're a pretty basic staple for we chum on the winter trips, so we're throwing a lot of fish out behind the boat. They're some of our best customers, I'll say. So we also get a lot of gulls. If you're interested in gull identification, which we all know can be a challenge, it's a good time to study different plumages and age classes of gulls. Here you have an adult herring gull on the left being chased by a young lesser blackback gull. That herring gull has a piece of chum that we've tossed out behind the boat to keep them occupied. Razorbill is another species that we regularly see in the winter. Typically, we'll see those on all of our trips. Sometimes we'll see thousands of them in a day. And there have been some influxes down to the south as well. I know there have been a few seasons where they've had them as far south as Florida. Bonaparte's gull is another species that we see pretty much on every trip, and they're a very attractive small gull. And we get to the toss-ups. Another species people don't realize that we see offshore from North Carolina is Atlantic puffin. We've recorded over 200 Atlantic puffins a few years ago east of Hatteras Inlet. Thick-billed murre. So the thick-billed murres have started showing up over the last few years, and maybe the last 4 or 5 years we've had common murre, which is pictured in the middle down here, and thick-billed murre on every year, not every trip, but we've seen them every year for the past few years. Now, this is because we've started running trips from both Oregon Inlet and Hatteras Inlet in the wintertime, and we found that these birds tend to really like the bathymetry east of Hatteras Island. So we do a lot of trips from Oregon Inlet, and those trips from Oregon Inlet are very good for producing these alcids. Manx shearwater is a tube nose like the northern fulmar. We'll talk a little bit more about tube noses in a minute. But Manx shearwater is a species that we can see pretty much any time of the year. So it's really fascinating to have a bird like that. But we might not see them on every trip in the winter. We do see them every winter. And some conditions can be a little bit better than others for them. But they have that tube nose. They can smell the chum that we're putting out in the wintertime, so sometimes they'll come right to the boat, like this individual. Red phalaropes. Some of you might know red phalaropes are wintering off the coast. We see them regularly on our winter trips. Again, not every trip, but they're a usual suspect kind of to see in the wintertime. So not every trip, but most trips we'll get a good look at them. And I say a good look, they're very small birds. You're on a boat, the boat's moving. Sometimes it's not as easy as it seems to get a good look at some of these species. Black-legged kittiwake. I was surprised to see some of these east of Jacksonville, Florida, a couple years ago in December. So I'm not sure if you all see black-legged kittiwakes kind of when they're moving south here off of South Carolina, but it would be a good bird to keep an eye out for. We tend to see them late January, early February, and then they've kind of moved out after that. But another really, great species to see out there in the winter. Little gull. I'm not sure if you all get little gulls down here, but they get in with the flocks of the Bonaparte gulls, and they seem like they should be super easy, right? They have these black underwings, so of course they stand out. But again, you're on a moving boat. There are a lot of birds around, sometimes hundreds of Bonaparte gulls. It can be a challenge to pick out a species that's different like this. So we have a lot of experienced leaders on our trips helping people pick out the characteristics that they're looking for and helping people to see the different species that we're encountering. We see what we call the white-winged gulls sometimes in the wintertime as well. This is an Iceland gull or Kumlian's gull. And typically we're seeing immatures of these birds. This one down here is a glaucous gull, which is much larger. But again, we typically see the immature plumages for these species, though occasionally we're lucky and we get to see an adult. That's an adult glaucous gull there on the bottom right. So northern fulmar, we did talk about that. This is a species, some years we see them, some years we don't. Some years we get an influx down from the north, and some years we go the entire season without encountering them. But they're a really special, scrappy little bird. They're smaller than most of the gulls we see, but they'll get right in there in the chum and take food from everyone else. They have good personality. Dovekies, is everyone familiar with dovekies? They're very small little alcids. Again, they can be challenging to see sometimes, but they are so cute. And occasionally they get blown inland. So sometimes, at least in North Carolina and sometimes further north, they'll get grounded and people find them. And so if you ever have a chance to hold a dovekey, enjoy it, because they're very cute. And this is another species. Some years they get down to us. Some years we don't see that many. Sometimes there are hundreds around, and other years we might just see a couple over the entire season. So the black-capped petrel, I forgot to tell you about the black-capped petrel on the first slide. The black-capped petrel was the bird that was up there to begin. There are signature species from Hatteras. It's a species that's offshore 365 days a year, but they live mostly in the Gulf Stream. So they're mostly in that warmer water offshore. Occasionally in the wintertime, we don't target the Gulf Stream, but sometimes that temperature break is close enough that we can get out closer to the warm water, and sometimes we get to see black-capped petrels in the wintertime. This big white upper tail on the black-capped petrel is kind of their identifying characteristic. It makes them a flying field mark. There's nothing else out there that size that's going to have that feature. So, all right, so now we're going to move into the spring. So again, we have the temperature map here. The key is a little bit different. So like this water that's here that looks like it should be pretty cool is actually 74 degrees Fahrenheit. And then you can see this really hot water of the Gulf Stream, that hot, fast water offshore. What you can also see is that there's a really nice change here. So that's indicating that you have a temperature break. Sometimes the temperature break could be 5 degrees Fahrenheit, sometimes it could be 3, sometimes it could be 7 degrees, just depending on the conditions, the wind, the current, everything else. But the spring can be a nice time to get some really interesting features like that, where you have those temperature changes. It can be very good for nutrient upwelling and for seeing seabirds. So our spring schedule for next year is up there. What we do in the spring, we run all of our trips from Hatteras Inlet, but we do what we call the spring blitz, where we go every day, sometimes for 2 weeks. And this, I think for 2025, I have 2 people signed up to do all the trips. So it'll be interesting, but everyone, it's like almost every year we'll have at least one person who says, I'm gonna do them all. Well, it gives you the best chance of seeing as many species as you can. So these are all the species we've recorded on our spring trips. It's a lot, because we get out there a lot in the spring. And not all of these are featured tonight, because a lot of them, like this Tahiti petrel that we saw back in 2018, we probably won't see many of them. We'll probably never see a Tahiti petrel again from Hatteras. But it's just letting you know, like, you just never know what you'll find offshore, and it's such a dynamic place. And seabirds, well, they have the whole ocean out there. So now we're going to talk a little bit about the tube-nosed seabirds. So Procellariformes is the order that these tube-nosed seabirds are in. This is a picture of a Bermuda petrel. They're in the genus Pterodroma. We'll talk more about them as we go through, but you can see this tubular structure on top of the bill. So this serves a dual purpose. These birds are marine organisms, right? They spend their whole lives at sea. They drink salt water. So they're able to take the salt out of that water, and then they excrete like a briny solution from those structures on their bill. They kind of sneeze out this briny, thick solution. The other thing that these tubular structures do is they serve to focus the scent molecules on their olfactory bulb. These birds have a very good sense of smell, and they do have a much larger olfactory bulb than you find in other seabird species without that tubular structure, or other birds in general. So, you know, we look around and we navigate by a landscape, right? We're using visual cues, but these birds can actually navigate by using a scentscape. So we look at the ocean, it looks like this featureless place with maybe some waves, but what they know is they know where you have something like the shelf break, where you have a seamount. They can smell food, so if there are fish coming to the surface and feeding, they can smell that from miles away. The other thing that's really cool about these birds is they come and go in the dark. So when they return to land, which they have to do, I imagine they're very upset by that they actually have to set foot on land to breed, but they return to their burrows at night in the dark, so they know their mate by smell and by sound. They're not really worried about how they look because they don't really ever see each other. But it's pretty fascinating because you don't think about these things. So the genus Pterodroma, I admit these are my favorite seabirds, so I'm a little partial to them, but these are the species that have been recorded or can be seen offshore from Hatteras. And of course we have the black-capped petrel, which is our signature species out there 365 days a year. We see them on every trip that we run targeting those Gulf Stream waters. This one in the middle is a big long shot, but I put it with the rest of the gadfly petrels because that's where it belongs. The Xenos petrel has only been documented once in North America back in 1995. Yes, slide film, manual focus, but it was accepted. And you know, since they're in the same genus and we could possibly see them offshore any time of year, I always like to remind people about the Xenos petrel. Top right corner, we have the Bermuda petrel. If any of you are familiar with that, it's a famous bird that was rediscovered in the 1950s after being thought to be extinct for about 400 years. They came back from about 18 pairs. That's another talk, you know, so it's a really great story. But Bermuda petrel and the Carolinas have a special relationship. Down on the bottom left, we have the Fayes petrel. I'm going to talk a lot about cryptic species, which are species that look similar but are different species. And the Fayes petrel complex is one of those. There's a Desertus petrel and a Cape Verde petrel. They look incredibly similar. What we see offshore from Hatteras are mostly Desertus petrels. And if any of you read, there was an article recently about these birds that chase hurricanes. No one. Okay. I'll send Mary a copy. But because the hurricanes stir up a lot of food for them, so they tagged these Desertus petrels and realized whenever there's a tropical system in the Atlantic, they're like right there behind it. And it's just really fascinating. We'd always suspected that was true, but it was cool to see it proven. And Trindade petrel, this bird down here on the bottom right, they used to be called the Herald petrel, but taxonomy is vexed at best with seabirds, which you'll realize as we go through. These birds nest off the coast of Brazil, and we see them every year usually. Some years we see more than others. So we'll go through each one of these in a little more detail. The black-capped petrel, of course, I was talking about that big white, like the upper tail on the black-capped petrel. Their upper tail coverts are entirely white, which gives them that nice big upper tail patch that makes them a flying field mark. You can see they have these nice pale underparts with the black leading edge to the underwing, and also they have this short, thick bill, which is diagnostic for this genus, the Pterodroma petrels. There are two color forms of the black-capped petrel. So here on the top right is a light form, and down here on the bottom left is a dark form. I can see that they look really different, but I'm not sure if you all can see that they look really different. But if you came out with us and gave it enough time, you would also be able to pick up on that. And we'll talk a little more about that towards the end of the talk. And then the Desertas petrel, again, that sort of cryptic species, Desertas versus Cape Verde petrel. These birds have, oh, sorry, I keep doing that, sorry. I am familiar, but not perfectly familiar with your clicker. So they have gray upper parts with this paler gray upper tail, and then they have these blackish underwings. They're, again, the only species out there that's gonna look like that. So that size bird with that the white belly, and they flip up and you see the dark underwings, it's like, oh yes, definitely a Phaeus type petrel or Desertas petrel. And then their cousin is the Xenos petrel, which I was mentioning. These birds nest in Madeira. There's only one record for the North Atlantic, only one record for North America from 1995. But they look really similar to those Phaeus petrels, right? The difference is they have this tiny little bill. They're much smaller and more slender, and they have a little more white in the underwings. Again, I wouldn't expect you to just pick that out if you were on the boat with us, but you would want to be keeping these things in the back of your mind and listening for us to tell you about them. Of course, these are photos I took in Madeira. These birds are highly endangered. They're less than 100 pairs right now, and not really increasing, which is true for a lot of our seabird species, unfortunately. The Bermuda petrel, the one who is bucking that trend, went from 18 pairs or up to 330 individuals. A really gorgeous bird that was first seen off the coast of North Carolina in 1983 by our curator of birds at the North Carolina State Museum, Dave Lee. That makes North Carolina a pretty special place because we're the first place that these birds were documented. Then again, the first place that they were photographed at sea after being rediscovered. And there's also a record for South Carolina. Does anyone know this? See, again, I get to teach you so many cool things tonight. So July 31st, 1993, someone was out on a NOAA vessel and documented one of these in South Carolina. The same day, someone documented one east of Hatteras Island. So there were two records from that year, just as we were starting to get moving. Now, this past year, we saw them on 5 trips, which was a record for us. But as their numbers are increasing, we hope that we'll be able to see more of them. Here's that Trindade petrel. They're highly variable. They have 2 color morphs, but they're going to be all dark above like this. And they look kind of rangy with these nice long wings, but you know, they're very variable. So here you can see a light morph on the left and a dark morph on the right. Really gorgeous birds. So we're going to move into the shearwaters. So you can see one of the main differences with the shearwaters versus those gadfly petrels is this bill. You see the bill on the shearwater is going to be long and slender compared to the gadfly petrels or the pterodroma petrels. So 2 species that we see, the black and white shearwaters we call them, Manx shearwater. Here's our Manx shearwater again that we can see every season of the year, winter, spring, summer, fall. But we see them in the springtime, a lot of times near shore, and these 2 species are considered to be a confusion species. So this is formerly the Audubon shearwater, and I still call it Audubon's without even thinking, but they have changed the name to the Sargasso shearwater. You can see they have this nice long tail that's dark underneath, and when you see them flying, this is a big thing with seabirds. They might look similar in a picture, but when you actually see the way they move over the water and through the air, they look really different. The Manx shearwater weighs twice as much as an Audubon's, and they fly really differently from the Audubon's. We also see great shearwaters, pictured here on the left, and sooty shearwaters. Great shearwaters start to show up end of May, beginning of June. These birds are coming from the southern hemisphere off the coast of South Africa and making a journey. They're just kind of passing by us as they head north to more productive waters off of New England and in the Canadian Maritimes. And sooty shearwaters, we get a nice pulse of those, usually in early May. Then we'll see them later in the year in bigger flocks of shearwaters. But the sooty shearwaters are also coming from the Southern Ocean. So these birds nest in New Zealand and Australia. It gets even better there. But yeah, both some really incredible ocean travelers. So I'm not sure how many of you have heard about the split with the Cory shearwaters. A lot of people had Cory shearwater on their list that got kind of put into this SPA, a species, because they split the Corys into the Corys and Scopoli shearwaters. Again, like some cryptic species, right? They look pretty similar, but one nests in the Atlantic. The Cory shearwater nests in the Atlantic. The Scopoli shearwater nests in the Mediterranean. The one difference we know, or one of the main differences we know for telling them apart, other than some size differences and a little bit of flight style differences, is the underprimaries. The Atlantic cories have dark underprimaries. The Scopolis have white in their underprimaries. So they have like this white wedge, whereas the cories are going to be all black. Pretty amazing. The cories mostly we'll see near shore, but we've learned now it's mostly Scopoli shearwaters that we're encountering offshore in the Gulf Stream in that warmer water. So storm petrels. So we're still in the tube noses, but we're moving on to a different group, and the storm petrels are very small. The Wilson storm petrel here on the left, they're kind of like our bog standard storm petrels. We'll get hundreds of them behind the boat. We have a different chumming methodology in the spring, summer, and fall. So we put fish oil out behind the boat that's kind of smelly, and then some chum blocks. And so they'll come in and they'll follow us for the entire day, just feeding on that oil behind the boat. The Wilson storm petrels do nest in Antarctica, and they actually nest on subantarctic islands. These birds are like the size of a purple martin. So it's pretty incredible. It's pretty amazing and kind of humbling to me to see them every year making this journey, and they're going farther north as well. You know, I call them the sun chasers. They're going up, you know, all the way up to where we have more daylight, and then they'll return back down to Antarctica to breed every winter. So the European storm petrel or British storm petrel, the bird pictured on the right, is an uncommon kind of rare visitor, but they're most easily confused with the Wilson storm petrel. They're very small, and they have really short legs, and they have this white in the underwing, which you hear a lot of yelling about those if we see one on the boat, and hopefully we can help you get on them. They can be a little bit challenging. But the Wilsons, again, they have these long legs, so a lot of times you can see those legs sticking out beyond the tail, and that's a good field mark for them. We see some larger storm petrels, the band-rumped and Leach's storm petrels. Band-rumped storm petrel is kind of a Gulf Stream specialty. So we see them, you know, they start to show up the end of May. We'll see them all the way through the summer in that hotter water, the hotter and deeper water offshore. Leach's storm petrels can be hit or miss. We get some good east wind. They're moving by farther offshore than we can usually get to, but that east wind will push them near shore, and so we'll see them sporadically on our spring trips and sometimes even on the summer trips. Band-rumped storm petrels, again, they have that sort of squared off tail. Leaches have a forked tail, and that upper tail shape is different as well. The big thing with them is their flight style. They fly differently, they move a little bit differently. Back to cryptic species, the band-rumped storm petrels, they're nesting on the other side of the Atlantic, so the northeastern Atlantic. There are probably 5 species of band-rumped storm petrel that we're not really able to differentiate at sea. So this is what we call a Grant's type. They're a winter breeder, so these birds are molting when we see them in the springtime, and that's how we can tell that that's the type of storm petrel we're seeing. Occasionally, though, we see these band-rumped storm petrels, which are smaller, closer in size to a Wilson storm petrel, and can make us kind of scratch our heads, but most likely these are Madeiran storm petrels, which is another type of band-rumped storm petrel breeding at the opposite season of the Grant storm petrel. So we're not confused yet, right? Everyone's like, oh my gosh, are we supposed to remember this? It's our job to tell you about it. So now we're going to move away from the tube noses and into the Jaegers and skuas. These birds also drink salt water. They just don't have those special tubular structures on top of their bill. That briny solution just kind of runs down their bill as opposed to having that special structure that our last group did. South Polar skua, the name says it all. These birds also nest in Antarctica and at subantarctic islands, and they come all the way up here, you know, every year. It's just amazing. They go up there are some that move up the Pacific side and some that move up the Atlantic side, and it's just always really cool to see something like that offshore. So we don't see them on every trip, but it's kind of a special visitor. These birds are what's called a kleptoparasite. The South Polar skuas will actually kill other birds out there and eat them. We've seen them do that a few times. Pomerine Jaeger, which is smaller than the South Polar skua and has a little bit of a different feature, they'll be more prone to kind of chasing birds and scaring food from them, but they will also kill birds at sea as well to eat. Long-tailed Jaeger and parasitic Jaeger are going to be the other two species that we see out there in this group. Long-tailed Jaegers, we see the adults. You can sort of see that long tail projection there. They're going to be the smallest Jaeger. We see them in adult plumage in the spring, and then as we move into the summer, we get to see some immatures. When you get the immature Jaegers, they can be really challenging. So sometimes you go on a trip and it's like, what did we just see? I don't know. It was either a long-tailed or a parasitic or a Pomerine. They're definitely some challenging species. So this parasitic Jaeger is a dark morph. They're also found in a light morph. So tropic birds. Certainly everyone knows tropic birds. We see both red-billed and white-tailed tropic birds on our trips offshore from Hatteras. In the springtime, we mostly see red-billed tropic birds. These can also be a challenge to tell apart at sea. The red-billed tropic bird is larger, but you can't always tell that if you're just looking at one individual bird, and size can be really deceiving at sea. So what you're looking for on these are these black coverts. So the black extends up into the coverts on the red-billed tropic bird versus just having black in the primaries for the white-tailed tropic bird. White-tailed tropic birds nest in Bermuda, so that's sort of the closest location. We tend to see more of those, and we'll see them starting in the spring, more often in the summer out there in the Gulf Stream. Sometimes, because this year we didn't see a single tropic bird until August, which was almost, you know, we were a little bit surprised and we were relieved that we didn't go an entire season without seeing them. They're always really cool to see, and they just kind of appear out of nowhere over the boat and then disappear just as easily. So we do see some terns offshore in the spring. Most people are looking for Arctic terns, pictured here on the left, told from the sort of similar sternotern, the common tern, by the short bill and the short neck, that nice little white cheek there. But we'll see both of these species offshore in the spring, and then as we move into the summer and fall, more often it's the common terns that we see, and then we'll also start to see the young ones. I have to put in the roseate tern because this, like over the past couple of years, we've had a few pairs of roseate terns who've taken up residence at Cape Point all year. And I think it was last year and the year before, we saw more roseate terns offshore than Arctic terns, which is really bizarre, but I guess to be expected, having them hanging out right there at Cape Hatteras. Phalaropes. So we talked about the red phalarope earlier that we see in the wintertime, but we get the red-necked phalaropes moving through as well in the spring and then in the summer. So when they're migrating through, this is the red-necked phalarope on the left. They have this dainty little bill versus this kind of thicker bill of the red phalarope. And again, red phalaropes are much bigger than a red-necked phalarope, and the markings are different, but that's why you have us to help you with those when we see them at sea. But a lot of times if we're lucky and we have a nice temperature break or nice line of sargassum, that's what this one is in, that nice floating brown algae, they'll stay put and we can get some pretty good views of them. So summer trips, now you can see this, they change this key a lot, right? So this color now is like 83 degrees Fahrenheit, whereas the last slide it was 74, but that's okay. It gives you an idea that this water here south of Cape Hatteras is really hot in the summer. So the Gulf Stream, we have the prevailing winds in the summer from the south. It pushes that warm water and the current a lot of times up on the shelf. We've noticed over the past few years that it can get a little bit stagnant out there. So we've started running trips in the summer also from Oregon Inlet. So we offer trips from both ports. The last 2 years we've done a summer blitz up the beach from Oregon Inlet, and we've had a lot of success up there. It's a farther trip to get out to the deep water, but you can see there's some nicer kind of temperature breaks up there to the north than we have from Hatteras. So species recorded on summer trips, also quite a few. We did have a Cape Verde shearwater back in 2004, which was a first North American record as well on these trips. Occasionally we see white-faced storm petrel, which is a cold water species more commonly seen, you know, offshore from Massachusetts, for example. But occasionally we get them in Hatteras. And we have had them actually in July in the Gulf Stream. So it's always exciting to see them, like the pogo stick birds. They kind of bounce along the water. They have these really nice long legs. But yeah, another cool species to see. So I didn't have a lot to add. Like most of the birds that I talked about from the spring, they're still around in the summer. Two species that we see more often in the spring and in much higher in the summer, sorry, and much higher numbers in the summer are the sooty and bridled terns. And by the summer, they have their attendant young with them. So down here in this inset, you can see this is a juvenile sooty tern. And then here's a juvenile bridled tern. And these youngsters will stay with their parents and be foraging at sea with them, kind of learning the ropes, but you'll see them in huge flocks, sometimes flocks of hundreds of sooty terns circling out over feeding flocks of shearwaters in the summer. So, you know, in the springtime we see a lot of different species. There are species moving through, but the summer we have, you know, higher numbers of individuals, and you get more practice a lot of times with the shearwaters and things like that. But it's always exciting to see the sooty terns. This one has like a little fish that it just picked out of the sargassum, and they'll feed a lot on that and on flying fish, which is always really cool to watch. So boobies, the masked booby and brown booby. We haven't seen a red-footed booby yet, which my feelings might be a little hurt since they're getting them all over the place, it seems. They've even had them in the UK, but it's okay. Ours is coming, I know, and I can add it to the list. But the masked booby and brown booby are both possible in the springtime for us, but as we move into the summer with the warmer water, that Gulf Stream water, they're really attracted to that clear blue tropical water, and they'll be hunting flying fish a lot of times. We'll find them out there. These are both adults. But you can see, you know, they have the black secondaries instead of white secondaries like a northern gannet. The facial pattern is different from a northern gannet. And the brown boobies are quite petite. The young ones are all brown, so that can invite a little bit of confusion, maybe with a young northern gannet. But when you see them, you realize they're petite, and a lot of times they'll show a little bit of that demarcation there between the really nice dark brown and the brown of their underparts. And there are also some differences with their upper tail and things like that that would differentiate them from a northern gannet. So the fall, we don't run as many trips in the fall because then the weather gets a little more volatile, so we add those weather dates again. But this past September, we only ran 2 trips, and we had 19 total species. We saw Bermuda petrel on one of those trips. We saw desertus petrel on one of those trips. We just had like really spectacular seabirding. The conditions were really great. And what you can see here is we have our temperature map again, but you can see these cool little eddies kind of starting to form in the Gulf Stream. So the habitat is a little bit different as we move into the fall, and you never really know what you'll find out there. And here's a sabins gull. So we do start to see the sabins gull. We actually had an adult on our trip, on one of the trips this past September. Black terns and common terns up there flying over top. Of course, this is when the Xenos petrel was documented. So that's the additional list for the fall trips. And the sabins gull is the only additional species I'm going to make you learn about tonight. Okay? So now we're going to move on to something different. So the black-capped petrel are signature species. They're locally known where they nest as the diablotin, which means the little devil. And that's from the sounds that they make. Remember, I said they're coming and going in the dark. They nest in the mountains of Hispaniola, which is the island that's home to Haiti and Dominican Republic. So you can see this is it's a revised distribution range that started to include the Gulf of Mexico. For a long time, they thought they weren't present in the Gulf of Mexico, but a lot of seabird surveys are finding they are there, just not in high numbers. And this is where they're nesting. So the stars represent the nesting colonies. These circles are just kind of like pie in the sky. We wish that they were nesting there, but no, the only burrows that we know of are in those two, a few colonies in those 2 countries, Dominican Republic and Haiti. There are only about 100 known burrows. So for this to be our signature species, like a really spectacular bird that we can take you offshore any day of the year and show you, they are highly threatened, and there's still a lot that we don't know about them. So they nest high up in the mountains, over 6,000 feet in elevation. Here in blue, we have the mountain ranges, and then in black are some of the colonies that we know of there and that are being tracked. And I was talking about the different color forms. So we had the light black-capped petrel all the way down to the dark, but there's a lot in between. So we really don't know what's going on with these different color forms. There was some mitochondrial DNA analysis done that showed 2 distinct nesting populations, but they're not necessarily 2 species or even 2 subspecies. We already knew there were 2 populations because the light-form birds molt about a month earlier than the dark-form birds, which means they're nesting about a month apart in time. You know, they have a temporal difference in their nesting. In 2014, Pat Jodis, he's actually from Clemson. I don't know if any of you are familiar with him. He does a lot of bird banding and had the permits to be able to track these black-capped petrels. This is the first ever satellite tags put on black-capped petrels back in 2014, and they were actually from the Loma del Toro colony there in Dominican Republic. This let us know that they were moving south of the island when they were foraging for their chicks, but it reinforced that they're using this area off the southeastern US. Now this is a dark form bird. Prior to this time, they'd never seen a light form bird in any of the colonies there on Hispaniola. So we're thinking maybe there's another place that those light form birds are nesting. How could we figure out where they might be? So a gentleman from American Bird Conservancy, Brad Keat, and there's Pat in the boat right back there. They decided to go out and catch some black-capped petrels at sea, right? We can put some tags on them, and maybe those light-form birds will take us to where they're nesting that we don't know about, right? So the secret weapon was this gentleman here. His name is Chris Gaskin. He's from New Zealand, and he has this specialized net gun that he uses for catching different seabird species at sea in New Zealand. And so they thought, oh, well, we'll just bring him here and we'll take this little rib and put it on the Stormy Petrel II, and we'll go way out there, put out a bunch of chum, and see if we can catch some black-capped petrels. And they were successful. So they caught 5 dark form birds. So this is a dark form bird. You can see that Argos tag there on the back. So the Argos tags mean that you can get real-time information about where those birds are moving at sea. And then here's one of the light form birds getting ready to be released. You can see the antenna on the back there. So this was in May 2019. These are the tracks of those birds as they moved at sea. What you can see is a lot of them were up here off of New England. Off of New England, all the black-capped petrel pictures that people take at sea are the light form birds. And so they said, oh, they're definitely using a different location. The dark birds are off the southeastern coast, so North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, Florida. And funny enough, 2 birds returned to Hispaniola. And one of them was a light form bird, but it went back to Dominican Republic. So we already knew that they were there. So at least they reinforced the idea that they are nesting on that same island with these other with the dark form black-capped petrels. And the date for this bird was September 30th, which was about a month ahead of when a lot of the darker birds returned to breed. So it did prove some of the things that we were, looking at. So now we do know there's this temporal difference, but we don't know where else they might be nesting in the Caribbean. That is yet to be, found. But we have a few more tagging projects in the works for those. So when I went back to school to get my master's in marine biology, I went back in 2021 because COVID shattered my plans for working on research vessels. I decided to look into this dark, light, black-capped petrel form. And at the State Museum, we have 65 black-capped petrel specimens because Dave Lee, that guy who saw the first Bermuda petrel record back in '83, did a lot of collection work offshore east of Hatteras Island. And he was like, there are a ton of these black-capped petrels out there. So he was collecting them left and right. Like, they must be very common, right? And then he finally realized, as they started checking other areas, that they actually weren't very common. They were just common in that location. So he collected them through maybe the late 1980s, but during that period of time, he collected 65 birds that I could then beg the museum to let me pluck some feathers from them and run stable isotope analysis and mercury analysis for my my master's thesis. So basically you can see I ran some statistics for all of the birds that I tested, and then dark and light, intermediate, male, female, for carbon, nitrogen, and sulfur. And then also down here you can see the mercury. And what I found was that they were things, again, that we already knew, and that we knew that these data would show us, that the birds are feeding offshore. Well, we kind of knew that. They're also feeding at a higher trophic level than other species. We also kind of knew that. They're top predators in the marine ecosystem. Their mercury levels were quite high, about 27 parts per million. Most birds have trouble at about 5 parts per million. Loons, for some reason, they are able to withstand high levels of mercury. Pterodroma petrels, the genus of these black-cap petrels, also seem to be species that can withstand quite high levels of mercury. And what we've been finding out about the way that these birds forage is they're very specific in their food prey items. And what they're foraging on are these mesopelagic species, so species that live below the photic zone. And we've heard a lot about this, the largest migration on Earth, right, with these species that move up and down in the water column. Those species have higher levels of mercury because they're below the photic zone, there's no oxygen down there, and this is something they found across the board. So it reinforced kind of something that we hoped that we knew about these birds, but weren't really certain of. So one of the things that was notable in what I found is that these stable isotope values were incredibly close, like a very low standard deviation over an 11-year period of birds that I tested. And what this tells you is that they're very tied. It doesn't matter, dark, light, male, female. They're very tied to one sort of ecosystem. So their foraging habitat is very similar. And what that means is even if birds are foraging off of New England, they're still foraging in that Gulf Stream influenced water because the Gulf Stream takes that turn, but it's still out there over the canyons where you find those birds off of New England. And they're foraging in the Gulf Stream waters also down here off of the southeastern US. So it really just reinforced how these birds are utilizing our offshore habitats. And I just wanted to end with kind of tying that together with how this can inform some of our decisions that are being made about wind energy development offshore. So some of the research is showing that these birds are very likely overlapping with some of these wind energy areas, especially the deep water areas that they're proposing off of Virginia and North Carolina. And one of Pat's former students put together these heat maps. So these are the tagged birds that we captured in 2019, the light form birds and the dark form birds, and he just kind of overlaid those on some of those wind energy areas just to show that, you know, all of the little pieces of information will help us as we move forward into the future. So I wanted to have one more cryptic species. This is another bandrump storm petrel. They haven't been recorded off of North Carolina. I think it would be pretty hard to know if we saw one, but I don't think I've ever seen one. It's the Montero's storm petrel. So they nest on an island called Graciosa in the Azores. And yeah, just one more thing, how much the more we learn, the less we actually know sometimes about these things. So my information is there, but Seabirding is our company. So if you wanted to find me, my email address and my phone number are all on our website, but you could also just take a picture and feel free to get in touch with me anytime, because I am the people person out of our group. My Captain Brian Pattison is not, we keep him in the wheelhouse most of the time. Don't tell him I said that if you come out. But okay, if anyone had any questions, I'm more than happy to answer any that you might have. Okay.
So,
Claudia.
these birds are at sea. Most of, like, what percentage of their lives is spent?
All of their lives except when they have to breed. So when they
that process, or what time frame does that take, and then how long does it take for the chicks to be able to go with their parents out to sea?
So it's interesting. All of them will be a little bit different. The tube noses, we know the most about the Bermuda petrel because they're actually actively tagging those birds and recording everything about their movements. The adults will come back, like either the male or the female will come back first, and usually its mate will arrive within 24 hours. And they're foraging in totally different locations, so they haven't seen each other since last year. And they usually will get back. The Bermuda petrels are returning about now, so this is a good time for I can give you timing for Pterodroma petrels. So they'll be back this month. They're gonna mate for many days. They're very excited to see each other. They'll spend 5 or 6 days together in their nesting burrow, and then they'll leave for their what's called the pre-laying exodus. So the female is going to go feed as much as she can so she can produce this huge egg that she's going to lay. It's just one egg. And the male is going to forage because he's going to be the first one on incubation duty. So the female will come back probably in January. She'll lay the egg. The male will be back right at the same time, which still is amazing to me how they know. So she'll lay the egg, and he'll take the first duty, and then they'll swap off. So one will go feed sometimes for as many as 5 days, sometimes as many as 12 days, and they'll do that off and on until the chick hatches, usually about March. Then they're going to be foraging for the chick. So the parents they don't stay in the burrow with the young one. They're just out working all the time to get food, and they'll feed the chick until they get him fat enough, him or her, and it will weigh more than its parents when they abandon it. And then they leave in usually sometime in late April, early May, and the chick will exercise its wings, build its muscles, and work off some of that food, the extra food it had, and then at some point it'll just go. And it probably won't come back for sometimes 3 years, sometimes 4 years. An albatross is very different. Albatrosses sometimes their cycle will take an entire 2 years to go through with the parent, with the egg and the chick and all of the things that they're doing, and then sometimes they'll take a year off in between. Their chicks might go to sea for 8 or 9 years before they return to breed. It's very species dependent. But they invest a lot of energy, and they usually just have one offspring that they're caring for. And then some of them will do that every year. A lot of them will take a year off because it's more beneficial for them. And if they have if they can't find the food they need to be able to reproduce effectively, they'll abandon the nest and take that time off to, build themselves back up. So they're very long-lived species. So they're going to live for 40 years or 50 years. So making sure that they are as productive as they can be is really important for that sort of lifestyle. Does that answer your question? Okay. And I'm going to, Alan was, yes.
You answered actually most of it. I was going to ask you about the foraging behavior when they're nesting. So just specifically when they're nesting, the young are in the nest.
So
is
when,
it a daily activity?
no, it depends. It depends on where the food is. So if there is food close to, and so this again can be answered best with Bermuda petrel because they're really working, like the Bermuda petrel, they have a translocation colony where they're trying to build the numbers, and the gentleman who is in charge of that population is constantly monitoring everything, and they're tagging those birds a lot. So they're figuring out when there's a lot of food around Bermuda, they're only gone for a couple of days, and they're only going, maybe a couple thousand miles. But if food is poor, they're going up to George's Bank, and they're traveling, they're taking a 7-day foraging trip, thousands and thousands of miles to get the best food for their chick. It's really impressive. And so we see black-capped petrels offshore from Hatteras. Some of those birds could be foraging for their chicks from Hispaniola. And it's really impressive. And if you look at some of the albatrosses, the larger seabirds that can spend a lot of time at sea, they go incredibly far for the food for their chicks. They'll go to the other side of the world and then back, just to get sufficient food to supply their chick with what they need to survive. They're like superheroes. I don't know. Okay, you were next.
Do the chicks come back to nest where they
That's a great question. So when I do the Bermuda petrel talk, I talk about this a lot because it's really important for things like a translocation colony, especially the gadfly petrels, but also the storm petrels and some of the other seabird species, the shearwaters. They do exhibit philopatry, which means they're returning to the nest, like the area from which they fledged. And that's why a lot of times when they're out kind of exercising their wings and they're getting ready to fledge, they're looking at the night sky, they're kind of orienting themselves for when they leave, and then typically sometimes they'll come back almost right next to the burrow that they fledged from. And what they'll do, how do you then make sure that you're not mating with someone that's too closely related to you? The females will tend to be more prone to leave their natal colony to mate with a male that seems to be suitable for her and has a good burrow. So, okay, yes.
If they're foraging 7,000 miles, how do they bring the food back? Is it like an egret does with regurgitation?
Yes. So they do store it in this nice oil that they then regurgitate for the chick. Yeah. Yes. Can birds be overweight? That's a good question. The chicks, before they fledge, can be quite overweight. And sometimes you'll find, I wouldn't say overweight. It's a little bit different. It's not unhealthy overweight, but sometimes they eat so much that they can't even take off from the water. And we've seen that, like some of the alcids, the birds I was talking about in the beginning in the wintertime, like the murres and the puffins, like sometimes they will eat so much fish that they can't even take off the water to get out of the way of the boat. It's really cute, actually. But they need to have that much food because it could be, they might not know when they're gonna get their next meal. So they'll eat as much as they can, and usually they're gonna be in a good place to kind of hang out until they need to be flying again.
When they're out foraging, well, you said the only time they come back to land is the mate. So they're out at sea. I assume that they're foraging just during daylight hours.
Good question.
And sleeping at night.
Not necessarily.
But let's say whenever they're sleeping, they are down floating on top of the water?
No, not necessarily. Like we've found with a lot of species, they can use just a kind of like shut off part of their brain when they're resting. So they don't sleep the way that we think of sleeping, but they're able to rest. And some of them can do that in flight. Some of them will sit in flocks on the water, especially if there's no wind. The wind makes it easier for them to be moving around. But what was the very beginning of your question? Because there was something else there that was do they forage at night? They do forage at night. And so like the black-capped petrels and the pterodroma petrels, they're feeding on probably bioluminescent creatures and squid and other things that come to the surface at night. And they just found that out recently by using the tags, where you can tell what the birds are doing, if they're in the water or if they're in the air, to be able to figure out that they're foraging. They're very opportunistic. So they will forage during the day, but sometimes if there's good food at night, they'll fill up and they'll all be sitting around on the water when we're out trying to find them. They won't come to the chum.
When they're sitting on the water, resting or whatever, or the ones that do, I would think they become targets then.
Most of them will have
I don't know who goes after them.
Yeah. Well, I don't.
Sharks or-
Yeah, I'm pretty sure that there are sharks that probably take some seabirds, but you'll find some that might be missing some feet sometimes. So someone eats. Someone can take off their little feet occasionally. But I don't know that it's studied as much, but a lot of them have that white belly so that they're going to be harder to see from below. And they're pretty in tune with what's going on around them usually. And like black-capped petrels are really skittish, so they're already going to be, they'll probably be out of there before anything even gets close. Yes?
As a group, their coloration amazes me.
Yeah.
Or a lack thereof.
Yeah.
So like you and I walked out Boardwalk 1, and we talked about seeing very colorful birds out there. But is there a disadvantage to being colorful, or do they not have breeding plumes?
Well, they don't. And so part of it has to do with like they really don't need to expend any energy on that because they're more using their, they're hearing each other and smelling each other as opposed to looking at each other. But the other thing is the dark feathers are typically going to be stronger feathers. And a lot of these birds are going to spend time in the tropical environment. And so you want something that's going to last longer. So that's one of the benefits of having those darker flight feathers and body feathers sometimes, which isn't true for the tropic birds, so don't ask me about them. But in general, the black feathers are going to be stronger for them than the light-colored feathers, yes.
Well, first of all, the questions have been very interesting. I wouldn't have thought of any of those questions. The last two slides about the wind turbines. How closely now, as today, the status is with the energy companies and the birding experts such as yourselves to where these things are placed?
So the Waterbird meeting I was at, it's been a year ago in October, we had a lot of wind energy presenters and a lot of seabird and shorebird presenters. And everyone is trying to make sure that it's all covered. And that's so the black-capped petrel, how could I forget this? They were just listed as an endangered species this January, so they're finally getting more protection here in the US. But that changes a lot of things for those wind energy projects that are based offshore of the shelf break. So the deep water ones are currently on hold, pending more information, but I don't think that they've taken them off the table yet. So we'll see. I'll keep you posted. All right. Oh, yeah.
Go ahead.
Oh, good. Oh, okay. All right.
All right, so let's
Thank you all so much.
Kate.
Thank you. The little guy. I know, and see, we can say there's another reason to come offshore from Hatteras, but we won't talk about the mammals today, but we can do that another day, because we're birds right now.
Yeah, exactly, we're birding.